So I'm reading a very fascinating book called The Peacemaker, and it's about Ronald Reagan's foreign policy efforts in containing and defeating the Soviet Union in the Cold War in the 1980s. And I'm seeing some parallels between then and what's going on right now. One of those areas is in this nuclear buildup that we were talking about last month. Back in the 1980s, we saw a buildup of nuclear missiles on the Soviet NATO border as well as near Japan. Today, well, in February of last year, Belarus decided to allow nuclear weapons in its territory. And last month, Vladimir Putin said they would put nuclear weapons in Belarus if necessary. Now, I don't know what that if necessary means, but it is something he's saying. Supposedly, the Russians are building a nuclear weapon storage facility to be ready in July 1st somewhere in Belarus, but I'm skeptical because nuclear weapon storage facilities are very complex and expensive. The Russian ambassador said these weapons would be close to the Polish border. Putin has also said that he has given Belarus or placed in Belarus 10 Russian aircraft configured to carry nuclear weapons. But there's no nuclear weapons from Russia currently in Belarus yet. What is likely when it comes to these aircraft is Putin doesn't want to risk a rogue Belarusian pilot bombing Russia. So any nuclear weapons are going to be under the control of Russia. This is unlike Germany, who has U.S. nuclear weapons, and it's a joint effort. In fact, the weapons that Germany has of U.S. are designed to be carried on German aircraft. So with regard to Russia, the air defenses that NATO possesses negate any kind of aircraft. I think the aircraft portion of this is just rhetoric. It's just trying to get people scared of Russia. And honestly, the Russians are just not very creative in this area. However, we cannot discount the Iskander missiles that are currently in Belarus, and they have the capability to carry a nuclear weapon, a nuclear warhead. They can be tipped with one. In response to this, Poland's President Duda has said they are discussing a nuclear sharing agreement with the United States and potentially may request a consult with NATO to provide a nuclear deterrent to their country. Again, history seems to be repeating itself because we've seen this before. 40 years ago, the USSR was deploying SS-20 intermediate-range missiles near Europe and Japan. West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt asked NATO for their own nuclear arsenal, and NATO responded by deploying 571 U.S. intermediate-range missiles and 108 Pershing II ballistic missiles in West Germany. The U.S. also provided Italy, United Kingdom, and Germany with 464 nuclear-capable cruise missiles as well. Interestingly, this escalate to de-escalate stance is what brought the Soviet Union to the negotiation table to talk about nuclear arms reductions. The U.S. started deploying in a manner that was very dangerous for Russia, or perceived dangerous for Russia, and because of that, Russia said, okay, we need to all take a step back, and they finally came to the negotiating table, which is actually Reagan's ultimate goal, was to reduce nuclear weapons. It was actually quite effective, and this book I'm reading talks about it. It was Germany back then that was the most vulnerable to a Russian threat. Today it is Poland. Currently, the United States has about 100 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs in Germany, and they're intended to be carried by Tornadoes and Eurofighter Typhoons. Both are non-stealthy aircraft. They're vulnerable to Russian defenses. So NATO might consider a different approach if Russia is moving missiles into Belarus. So something that can better penetrate enemy air defenses and deliver a nuclear payload over a gravity bomb carried by a Gen 4 aircraft. Well, there's really only 4 options that NATO has to react to Russia's potential move of nuclear weapons to Belarus. The first is to recognize it for what it is. This is a desperate attempt from Putin to get the West to back off from his ambitions in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. So take no action. We've seen this before. Escalations from Putin. He has no conventional force strong enough to take on NATO, period, at all. Not even close. It would be devastating. So he has to rely on nuclear rhetoric, and he uses it all the time. It's his nuclear rhetoric button he pushes constantly. So if the United States and NATO takes no action, they just once again signal to Russia that you're just a bunch of toddlers that are throwing temper tantrums. And the reason that they could take this stance is NATO probably can determine that their current nuclear forces that are composed in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and France are an adequate deterrent. There's more than enough weapons between those three countries to wipe Russia off the face of the earth in response to a potential nuclear attack on Poland with medium-range missiles. Now, the argument comes up, well, if they're using tactical nuclear weapons, would the United States respond with strategic weapons? And before I get into that, tactical nuclear weapons are smaller. Think about a nuclear weapon that is designed to kill everyone on a battlefield versus kill everyone in a city. So a battlefield would be thinking like maybe a couple football stadiums in size. That's how big it is. Whereas a strategic nuclear weapon would be destroying everything in like New York City or something like that. Russia has tactical nuclear weapons. The U.S. really doesn't. So would we respond with strategic nuclear weapons to a tactical nuclear weapon attack? Well, the reality is I make the argument that tactical nuclear weapons are still strategic. The calculus on warfare changes the minute you use nuclear weapons. It doesn't matter whether it's tactical or nuclear. That cat is out of the bag, and the escalations are going to continue until there's a devastating effect, essentially. So that's the argument for doing nothing, is the U.S. doesn't change its posture, the NATO doesn't change its posture, knowing that it has an adequate deterrent in response to any nuclear attack from Poland. Option number 2 involves possibly deploying stealth capability to Europe, which we don't currently. The B-61-12 gravity bomb is designed to be launched from the new highly advanced and very stealthy B-21 Raider stealth bomber. And it is a non-ballistic nuclear option that could match Russia's moves. It could show that you can't just continue to escalate without some sort of retaliatory escalation. And that may be a situation. We may once again revert to that escalate to de-escalate scenario. Or third option is we follow the 1980s playbook and deploy new intermediate range missiles by adding nuclear capability to the Army's new strategic mid-range fire system, which the acronym sounds out as SMRF. That's freaking awesome. And then deploy those missiles in a ground-based location in Poland somewhere, just throughout Poland. Similar to the 1980s. We did the exact same thing in the 1980s. Again, potentially escalating to de-escalate. We'll see. Now, the final option would take a bit longer, but there's a possibility of moving ahead with the proposed sea-launched cruise missile, which has the capability of carrying a nuclear weapon as well. But it seems somewhat redundant to me to the Trident ballistic missile system. Even though the Trident is more of a strategic weapon than a tactical nuclear weapon, as I said just a bit ago, no nuclear weapon is not strategic. All nuclear weapons are strategic weapons. It doesn't matter how big they are. So Russia deploying their Iskander missiles may see some form of response, like from the U.S. and NATO in this regard. My personal preference is to do nothing, as any tactical strike would be met with an overwhelming NATO conventional force destroying Russia, which would therefore likely lead to a strategic nuclear exchange anyways. But if we need to signal to Russia that they can't escalate without a response, the best route would probably be deploying our stealth capability. Interestingly, there's really no word on China's feelings about this, because it was kind of a slap in the face that Putin announced the deployment of the nuclear weapons to Belarus a mere 2 days after telling Xi Jinping that he would not deploy nuclear weapons beyond their territory. But then again, as with Ukraine and other places, Russia may see Belarus as just an extension of their territory. So we shall see what takes place. Are we going to replay a bit of the 80s, where we start to escalate Russia in a manner that they inevitably have a choice to make, either back off, use those weapons, or face a Cold War-like scenario where they inevitably collapse because they can't match militarily and economically the West? It's almost a very similar situation we're looking at right now.